Several thousand Staling Gradies once lived or existed in Camp 108-1. It was impossible to know how many of them had perished before my arrival. Everyone knows, however, that the dead were stripped before they were taken somewhere to be buried in the steppe. The clothes were stored in a warehouse run by a German superintendent. In addition to the superintendent, a group of prisoners of war worked there, whose task was evidently to tidy up the mass of coats, overcoats, uniforms, pants, shoes, and boots stored in. Nowhere and by no one was it recorded how many copies of the individual categories went into this warehouse. The lack of warehouse accounting served as the basis for a lively trading activity. Demand from the civilian population was for shoes, winter overcoats, and fur. The German personnel of the warehouse offered those willing to let go of the relevant goods for sale at their own risk. The wholesaler traded with the only risk of being caught when releasing the goods from the warehouse. The risk was minimal because the supervising Soviet official was stealing on a par with the Germans. The dealer's risk was enormous because he had to pay for the goods in advance. A pair of good boots, 1 kilogram of bread, a pair of boots without flaws, 2 kilograms of bread, a winter overcoat, 2 kilograms a fur coat, 4 kilograms. Toilers Rembaza received 1 kg daily, which means that to join the trading system, you first had to accumulate a contribution, giving the wholesaler, say, 200 g of bread for 10 days. So there he got a pair of boots. The first chance of failure is theft in the housing unit. There are comrades who steal anything they can get their hands on. Thieves, if caught, are beaten nearly to death, but the stealing doesn't stop. The second barrier is getting to work. The watchmen know that a certain number of prisoners try to leave the camp with contraband. The level of risk of being caught at the gatehouse is determined by the margin of time to search. A convoy of about 500 people moves through the gatehouse, and the time of its arrival at the Rembazar is strictly set. Therefore, it is only possible to search those being taken to production in a selective manner. The most effective method of disguising smuggling is to act in pairs. The partner, who has no contraband, should draw the attention of the watchman to himself by somehow blowing his overcoat on a place where the boots could be hidden. If the staging is skillfully executed, the watchman rush at him, while the smuggler skips outside. Thus, the risk of losing goods when leaving the camp was no more than 10. At the Rembaza, buyers were met in the restroom precisely because none of the watchmen dare to be on duty all day at a stinking place in order to catch a smuggler. Contracts were made with a wink and a gesture. The prisoner hung his overcoat on a hook, and the citizen hung his bag of groceries, according to the verbally concluded contract. The citizen put on the overcoat. The prisoner went away, hiding the bag under his clothes. Exiting the restroom is the second critical point in the trade chain. It was not uncommon for the janitor to ambush the outside of the latrine, make a search and take away the booty. Therefore, the practice of contracting janitors was introduced. There was a cunning representative of this category who came up with the idea to get interest from each transaction. It was better than destroying the base of trade. Under the guardianship of such a janitor, the traders lived quite well, as long as the guardian kept the upper hand over the competitors. The greatest danger of losing profits from trading activities was the gatehouse during the evening return from work in the camp area. In this situation, the gatekeepers were not to be hurried. Determining the number of returning prisoners was time-consuming, so there was also much more to search than in the morning. Lard, fish, or makorka. All these, when discovered, were taken away without conversation as the result of an illegal act. It was useless to protest. The maximum profit from a transaction of this kind in bread units was about 100, taking into account the loss of all goods in every 10th transaction. But if an ordinary dealer managed to get through without losses 2 or 3 times, such trade became unpromising, because it was impossible to accumulate capital in bread or gauze units. Without a solid bank, there is no capitalism. And if someone had accumulated stocks under his pillow, they were sure to be stolen. And this would be done by members of the self-government from among prisoners of war who were not taken to work and had unlimited opportunities to control the premises in the housing blocks. 100% profit remained only with the storekeepers, who lived well-fed at least during my entire stay in this camp. I personally tried to participate in the trading system described above, but other than losses, nothing more came out of it. I managed to acquire some allowances of edible substances through the sale of homemade knives and other kitchen equipment, and more could be said about the organization of artels within the Rembaza than about the trading system. Generalizing, I can say that I spent the first 2 months in Krasnoyarsk without significant weight loss. I became an experienced electrician, the Russian foreman recognized the quality of my work, and the maximum daily ration of bread so far saved me from further approaching hell. Catholics and evangelicals celebrate the Holy Evening of Christ's birth on December 24 on the current calendar. This is the first time in my life that I've met this holiday far away from my parents' home. For Germans, this holiday comes first. Christmas is a celebration of family. It is hard to remember that mother and father must be looking at the decorated Christmas tree, and their thoughts are flying across the vastness of Russia, not finding the place where their youngest son lives or lies in the cemetery. Sadness, longing, and heartache are the feelings that overwhelmed me these days. A few days before Christmas, I made an artificial Christmas tree from a piece of multi-strand telephone cable I found in a wastebox at a repair depot. I made decorations from capacitor foil and thin brass sheet. One janitor at the gatehouse took away this object of my art, but the officer on duty returned it, and in the so-called library of our corps, the symbol of Christmas began to shine. And what motivates people to go on such exhausting ventures? Some want to avoid boredom, idleness in a poorly heated barrack. Others are hunting for a piece of extra bread and a quarter liter of millet porridge, and most, perhaps, do not deny both motives. December has passed. How the Christmas holiday was spent, I don't remember. I think that to celebrate the holiday lacked mental and material resources. We spent these days as working days, because church holidays were not recognized in the Union at all, much less the dates of holidays according to the Gregorian calendar. How we met the New Year of 1945, also it is not possible to extract from memory. The meeting was probably indifferent. The end of the war was imminent, there was no doubt about that. But no one could know what would happen to the prisoners of war. The New Year of 1945. I'm called to the gatehouse. The commandant of the school zone meets me. Take your things, you won't come back here. You'll be the head attendant of the school zone. I have no idea where such a high estimation of my abilities came from. Did mastering the Russian language give me my first win? The chief attendant is, from the point of view of an ordinary prisoner of war, the most desirable position in the camp. Not only the woodchoppers, janitors, firewood carriers and the staff of various workshops, but also the kitchen staff are subordinate to him. Still, I could not suppress some doubts about my ability to lead such a refined circle of professional prisoners, moreover, still in the school zone. The doubts turned out to be justified. The service staff had decided that cadets snitch, and it was difficult to find an approach to them. It was felt that the Council of Brigadiers of the service staff decided to prove to the command that the head of the service staff was an unnecessary position. The work was organized without me, and if I tried to introduce new orders, they sought from the Soviet leadership to cancel my innovations. But in spite of such red tape, I won. I was assigned a small room, a kind of bureau where I was rarely seen by anyone. There I sat for many hours over papers and worked on further improving my knowledge of Russian spelling and compiled a dictionary. I found books in Russian. For the first time I read The Tale of Belkin and The Captain's Daughter. Success in studying linguistics raised my self-confidence in contrast to the poor results of my position. In addition, I had the opportunity at any time to turn to various persons of the Soviet leadership and in conversations in practice to test the theoretical achievements. It was the spring of 1945. The command was obviously convinced that the distinguished brigadiers of the service could cope with the case without the senior, who as an informer did not show any initiative. Spring-summer 1945. Suddenly I received an Gar Times. Head your things, hew for the passageway of the work area. A group of prisoners of war of the first category, exclusively Germans, had gathered there. This is a positive fact, for in this large camp a mixed team from all nations of Europe could have been recruited. The majority of those gathered were familiar to me. Battalion and company commanders, brigadiers, cooks, bread cutters, wood cutters, in a word, rich men in physical condition. In all, about 100 men, accompanied by convoys headed by an officer, we said the direction is familiar, to the south, where the railroad is located. For the fourth time on foot, I measured the way to the town of Vyazniki. There they put us in passenger cars specially allocated for us. The train goes to the east, and after a short trip is ordered to get off at the station of the city of Dzержinsk. Then we move on foot to the north. No one knows why or where we are going. Convoys are silent as if dead. We go deeper into the forest, and suddenly we see a small village in a clearing and towers sticking out behind it. Only from a very short distance it becomes clear what kind of camp this camp is. A dugout one. For us, who were used to two-story buildings with big windows, to get into the dugouts was our first fear. We enter the zone, see our fellow countrymen, and realize with even greater fear, exclusively dystrophics. It is clear now why they sent out 100 rich men from the central camp. The composition of the prisoners is exhausted to the limit and new supplies are required to strengthen the labour front. But what kind of front is this front? We hear the word torf, and no one in our group has any idea what work on peat means. But for now, all new arrivals are caroled into an empty dugout for quarantine. 2 weeks of confinement in a barbed wire fenced quarantine zone. There is no occupation. All day long we have to sit on the bunks or walk along and across the small area of the quarantine zone allotted to us. There are the first conversations with representatives of the main staff of the camp, by shouting at a distance of 20 meters. The rumours are unfortunate. Of 30 of the initial staff died in 5 months of winter. The work is extremely hard, and the self-government of the camp is in the hands of a bunch of Serbian Chetniks and Romanians, who blatantly, with the command staff of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, jointly stealing and squandering both foodstuffs and uniforms of the dead, who were buried naked. None of the Germans speaks Russian. There is no one to complain. About 80 of German prisoners are dystrophic, and none of them is able to work on laying rails on peat under hydro monitors. Among the newly arrived, there are rich men not only by physical constitution. There are many people with great organizational abilities and 3-4 people with excellent knowledge of Russian language. A kind of emigrant government is being founded with one point in its program of action: down with the Serbian-Romanian mafia. Back in the days of quarantine, government commissions are organized for certain areas of action. The Prime Minister is a landowner of German nationality and Romanian citizenship, who speaks 7 languages and all the techniques of leading people. I, completely inexperienced among professional politicians, am left in reserve, i.e., operational plans do not reach me. My fate directs me along a completely different line. It is the 10th or 12th day of quarantine in the Camp Pyra on peat. I am lying on the bunks, fighting boredom. The chief of the camp, a major, comes in. Someone shouts, "Attention! Attention!" Everyone reluctantly rises, standing, expecting something unpleasant. Major asks, "Who knows how to make toys?" The experience of the German soldier is, on no account answer such announcements. This is because in the German army it is customary to send volunteers to clean latrines and other not at all cheerful activities. My experience during 2 years of captivity was quite different. Namely, when the Russians declare a need for some specialists, then they really need them. In addition, I was very eager to make all kinds of toys out of plywood and other materials at home. Why not use these skills and thus get away from the hard industrial work on the peat? Big silence. Toys. There must be some kind of mockery behind them. I can do it. Well, let's make samples. I'll be back in a couple of days to see the result. I said, I went, but where to get the tools? Where to get the plywood? Well, I have a pocket knife, a holy thing, which I dragged through many searches. Plywood, the ceiling of the dugout is covered with plywood, and there's an extra piece. Paints, ink pencil, iodine solution, diamond gran is enough for now. On the second day, I present the chief gymnast on the bar, gymnast on the bars and a functional model of a gun. The officer's reaction is completely unexpected. So to expression starts to test my samples and says, "Fine, you will be the brigadier of toys. As soon as the quarantine is over, you will find 10-15 masters among the dystrophics, and you will organize serial production of such toys. Not a single word about tools and materials. The quarantine is over. Brigades are being formed for peat. In this case, our government achieves its first success. Germans are appointed as brigadiers, while the Serbian command dreamed that the Germans were to work under purely Serbian leadership. Our Prime Minister is appointed deputy camp commander, since Romanian was his second mother tongue, and he knew the traits of the Romanian national character by heart. He quickly managed to reach an agreement also with this faction of the camp rulers, which worked mainly in the kitchen and its periphery. A great step was taken toward isolating the Serbian faction, whose members occupied all command positions near the command staff of the Interior Ministry. One night, 2 months after the end of quarantine, a commotion began to rise outside the zone's fence. The rumble of vehicles and 2 gunshots. In the light of a searchlight in front of the warehouse dugout, a crowd of people in the uniform of the Mia troops moves. Then the cars move away and there is silence. Information about what happened that night did not leak out to us soon. But the next day it was obvious that the officers of the command had changed and 10-15 Serbs on a truck left the camp. A year later I learned that our Prime Minister had contacts with the higher authorities of the GBGVI. He managed to inform the controlling bodies about a planned large-scale theft of food and uniforms organized by the camp authorities in cooperation with the Serbian top. A mixed group of thieves was ambushed and removed to who knows where. A commission of the control authority, including a team of doctors, visits the camp. They determine the category of each prisoner, restore the proper work regime according to the categories of physical condition, and day by day the rations are noticeably improved. Living conditions in the camp rise to the average level. In this all-round positive environment, I start to walk around the dugouts in search of fellow toy makers. The result is stunning. 1 blacksmith, 1 toolmaker, 3 modelers, 2 masters of making artificial flowers from birch shavings, and several carpenters. The blacksmith, toolmaker, and modelers are the first to start working. In the camp, even before the arrival of prisoners of war, there was a forge with a stock of wooden coal and blacksmithing tools. In a few days they create tools for woodcutting, planners, various shaped gobbles, in a word, everything that is necessary for making toys. The production is developing, and the products with full baskets disappear to unknown places. Someone from the work brigade, which in the village of Pyra works on the manufacture of roofing shingles, learned from a Russian worker that our toys are sold at the bazaar in Dzержinsk. Well, it's none of our business where our products go. We work in a covered room. The work is interesting, and there are members of the Soviet camp staff to whom we do not quite legally release part of the superproducts, and they bring us gifts in the form of bread, milk, fudge, newspaper, and other products, with which we are a little spoiled. The war is over, and the words home soon are flying to us from all sides. The new command of the camp includes a significant percentage of disabled frontline soldiers who treat us prisoners differently from the former command of the Interior Ministry troops. The reader may realize that I wanted to remain in charge of toy production until I returned home. Production figures of toy makers are growing. Written reports, which I make with the pedantry of an accountant, delighted the new camp chief. It turned out that being an excellent student is not always profitable for the excellent student. A new transport arrived with German prisoners of war from Germany itself. New without any experience, as it seemed to us, the last hope of the German command. People not at all accustomed to physical labor and often incapable because of physical disabilities. A large tent with bunks for 120 men was built in the zone, and the camp commander needed a tamer to tidy up this circus. How he settled on me only God knows. More likely the devil told him to. I had to leave my separate bed in the toy manufacturing room and settle into a ventilated tent amidst a crowd of rampaging newts. Once, back in the flight school, I was in charge of a group of 15 people, a senior attendant dealing with a disciplined staff of no more than 30 people, and now 120 depressed or crazy new, who still had a vague idea of what discipline is in the institutions of the Gulag archipelago. The task was unfamiliar, unpleasant, and as it seemed to me, beyond my strength. I did not know that it was absolutely impossible to penetrate such a structureless mass alone. In time it came to me that individuals should be given at least meagre privileges, who, for that price, would in turn be willing to serve as sheepdogs. At last I accomplished this, and the number of reproaches heaped upon my innocent head gradually diminished. One day I had an almost friendly conversation with the camp commander, and I ventured to ask him why he had appointed me as company commander. The answer was simply, "You speak and write Russian, you know how to learn, that's all." The work on the Pete was very hard, the hardest of all on the relaying of rail tracks of hydromonitors. The gauge of these tracks is about 3 meters. The length of sleepers is not less than 4 meters. The length of one section is 6-7 meters, i.e., there are not less than 10 sleepers. With the progress of peat extraction, the rails of the hydraulic monitor must be retreated accordingly. It is no joke to manually lift and drag the rail sections of these dimensions over a distance of about 5 meters, especially when the path crosses a bog. When lifting a section, workers sometimes stand in waist-deep water. The sleepers seem to be sucked into the muddy ground, and to tear them off requires twice the weight of the section itself. A crew of up to 30 healthy men is required. The men suffer not only from the drudgery of the work, but also from the corrosiveness of the swampy waters. Many have open sores. It is a little easier to work in the fields where the peat is dried. The peat raw material is piped to the field where the water is drained and evaporated. The layer of wet peat is cut by special caterpillars into bricks, thus preparing another portion of hard physical labour. To lift and cross-stack the bricks, all of which due to the significant moisture content is quite high. The whole 8-hour day standing with a bent back, lifting and moving 10-kilogram bricks is a real punishment. It should be taken into account that under the summer sun, without any shade, on the surface of the field, 40–50 degrees of heat. The easiest part is loading dry peat bricks into narrow gauge wagons, which carry the fuel to Balakna Chirp. I worked several shifts at all the sites by choice, and more than once my thoughts returned to the southern fortune teller. Seeing the misfortune of my comrades, I could rightly consider myself lucky. The summer of 1945 passed. My circus became cool, and I should not have thought of returning home. Wintering in a tent was impossible. What will happen? At the end of September, we received a rescue order to take our belongings, to assemble in a marching manner, and to line up the whole camp in a company at the gatehouse. The personal property of a prisoner of war is not a weight. A spoon, a folding knife, a wallet with photos of the family and a camp kettle. That's it. The rest is considered illegal and can be seized during the monthly search. But no searches have been conducted in Pyra lately, and the result is that the shoulders of the prisoner are not a geriatric backpack, but a tightly packed coolie. Where does a prisoner get so much junk? I don't know. Where they will take us, again, only the command knows. How far, on foot or by transport? Not a word about that. Must be a heated building. I should have dwelt more on the abuse of those Soviet organizations that sent disarmed enemy soldiers to the rear, not knowing where to put them, at the expense of what to feed and drink. Therefore, they sent them to the rear as inanimate cargo, private servicemen of the Ministry of Internal Affairs troops who accompanied such echelons of death, carried out strict orders which made death walk with a scythe on the wagons, and not having carried out such an order they themselves could fall under the scope of this scythe. So how is it better than those echelons that carried Jews to German camps? So there were atrocities on both sides of the front. Some of the newcomers got into the school zone, and an avalanche of questions about living conditions in the homeland descended upon them. With one of them I managed to establish a closer contact. One day he asked me if I knew anyone who was interested in learning Russian. Why would you do that? I asked him. I have a German textbook of the Russian language for self-study from a dead comrade. I would like to get bread for it. I'll gladly take it. We made a bargain. 7 daily portions of bread to be paid within a month. It wasn't an easy decision. I was deprived of a quarter of my bread ration for a whole month, but it was a gateway to the future, and I understood that. In order to get a job as a translator in my homeland, one must have a good knowledge of spelling. I bought, honestly paid for the textbook, and in my life I earned 100,000% interest for it. Many, many hours I sat over this book, as a result of which the textbook got worn out, its weight became less and less. But my knowledge of the Russian language added more and more to my brain. What luck! No one for the whole period from the summer of 1944 even tried to take away this treasure from me. How not to remember the gypsy fortune teller? Autumn came, and with it the end of my studies at the courses. We were preparing for distribution. The most trusted ones were assigned to the front to conduct oral propaganda by loudspeakers across the front line. Especially diligent ones were sent to give lectures, travelling around groups of camps, and the infantry was sent to the camps as a reserve until demanded. Many of them were assigned, and their mood was high in anticipation of political work. It became very quiet around me. My comrades were leaving, and nobody paid any attention to me until the escort came and told me to follow him with my things. Where to? To the work area of the camp. What a disappointment for the whole period of my studies. After that fatal question about the creator of matter, there were no reproaches against me, and I thought that I had earned the trust of my teachers by diligent study of all subjects, and they chased me away like a stray dog. Without any explanation, I turned into a nobody. What to do? I had to move on. I finished these courses for a reason. I understood a lot, acquired new knowledge that will serve in the search and defense of my beliefs and actions after the captivity. I still have no doubt that I am now a Marxist. though with a bias away from the Soviet scheme of organization and Stalinist dogmatism. At school, we got this view that for communists, social democrats are worse than fascists. So I tried to avoid the idea that I was much closer in character to the most moderate ideology of social democracy. Intermezzo, the working area of camp. No. 160. The working area of the camp was huge. As far as I remember, there were no less than 10,000 prisoners of war of almost every nationality in Europe, in addition to the soldiers of the national military units of Italy, Hungary and Romania. There were volunteers of the Spanish Blue Division and an extremely variegated palette of volunteers of the SS Special Units, in which served representatives of literally all nationalities of Europe, including Swedish blondes, charming Frenchmen, and ready-for-any-murder Serbian Chetniks. Why the Gulag concentrated such a mass of men in such a place, where the nearest narrow-gauge railway station was 15 kilometers from the camp itself, I have no idea. It was not easy to organize the supply of so many men. There were not even enough labor assignments. Thousands of people were lying on bunks, in poorly heated barracks and dugouts. They were fed so poorly that the physical condition of the people reached complete exhaustion. The head of the kitchen was a German immigrant woman, Grunberg. Her husband worked as a teacher in the school zone, i.e., he had to convince the Germans of the deep humanity of the Soviet system. If people approached her with complaints because she understood German, they would hear in response, "Take your complaints to him." The only regular activities were the collection of firewood and foodstuffs. A large amount of firewood was collected during the summer, but whether the winter was too harsh or the number of prisoners exceeded the limit, the fact was the same. At the beginning of December, the firewood ran out. In view of the fact that the camp was situated in a deep forest, there was plenty of wood around. But it was impossible to cut trees, prepare and transport firewood to the site without healthy labourers. I did not have to look for work for a long time. Already a day after my arrival in the working zone, in the canteen during the breakfast, the running around in search of volunteers for felling wood began. Everyone will be given felt boots, sheepskin coat, fur gloves and an Oshanka hat, in case of fulfillment of the additional bread and porridge. Volunteers had to be found because the frosts were stable, about 30 degrees, and the mandatory withdrawal to work at a temperature below 20 degrees is not provided by statute. I turned to the recruiter with a request to enroll me. He examines me like a slave owner when buying a new slave. During the months of the course I have recovered, and my figure, obviously, satisfies the requirements of the brigadier. An hour later, the column sets off into the forest. We have excellent professional tools, axes, cleavers, swords. Russian winter. There is not a single cloud in the sky, there is no wind. We are really dressed, i.e. we are not freezing, and the guards are running back and forth, controlling our noses and ears, preventing these important protrusions of the head from freezing. At the logging site we light a fire. In groups of 3 we start working. The German foreman is a clever man. In the whole camp he has picked up loggers professionals, but due to the fact that the percentage of loggers among the labour population of Germany is very low, to make up the proper number of brigades for logging from professionals has no chance. An effective solution to the problem is to form groups of 3, with 1 professional logger in command. In this way, high labour efficiency is achieved and accidents are avoided. Each team has 6 teams of 3 + 1 specialists for sharpening saws and axes. The work is going amicably. It is possible to fulfill the norm with skillful organisation of work. I am very satisfied with my commander, who for 20 years has accumulated experience in logging in the Bavarian forest in southern Germany. The working time passes quickly. As the sun sets, we head back to the camp. Once again, I admire the beauty of nature. The landscape is snow-white with a blue sky above it, gradually turning into a solid fire. Everything in red sparkles. Black silhouettes of pines are filigree on the flame background. One can go crazy at the sight of such a picture. We return to the camp cheerful and satisfied. In the canteen, we are waiting for dinner with interest. We can't say that our stomach is full, but, thank God, we don't feel hunger. The feeling is relatively good. Can't we call a person lucky who in a harsh winter is free from suffering and heavy experiences, far from the fierce fighting, far from the bombing of German cities, lives out of any danger, in relative peace? Supporters of this philosophy of life seek each other out, and their evening conversations are filled with gratitude for the privilege of living without the constant threat of death and for the privilege of the real hope of remaining healthy in the near future. I personally know how to rejoice in the beauty and a single flower in the vast wilderness. For that I thank fate. In the meantime, the forest is covered with snow. The roads are impassable for motor transport, and food supplies, as it turned out, are running low. Food is brought by narrow-gauge railway, but from the nearest station to our camp, as we already know, is 15 kilometers. A daily ration for one person is 300–400 grams of food. Therefore, for 10,000 people per day, we need 3–4 tons of flour, cereals, fats, and other things. For foodstuffs, it is necessary to go by sledge, but there is no harness except for us, the prisoners of war themselves. So again we hear the call for volunteers even on weekends. Volunteers are the same as for firewood, but going for food is especially interesting, because the packing material is not armor after all. When the barrier between a perpetually hungry prisoner and edible matter consists only of burlap, plywood, or cardboard, how can you not find a way to overcome that barrier? In the search for such ways, the boundless ingenuity of the boys was manifested. Cargo sleds were of different sizes. On the smallest, 4 people in the sled and 1 steering man behind. On the largest, 14 pullers and 2 steering men. A rope was attached in front, in the loops of which sticks about 1½ meters long were inserted. On each stick to the right and left of the rope is 1 puller, and on the large sleds 7 pairs, one after the other. There are about 30 sleds of all sizes in the column. We leave the camp area early in the morning in the dark. The road is snowed up to the knees. It is hard for the head crews to make a ski track. An alternating system is used. The head crew has passed 200 or 300 meters, skips the whole column, and gets caught in its tail. Despite the use of such tactics, it takes about 5 hours to reach the station. There the wagons are unloaded and the cargo is distributed on sledges, and thus begins the fun part of the enterprise. The convoyers, though shouting, look through their fingers at the occupation of the steersman. While the sled is pulling, the helmsman is not steering, but preparing access to the edible contents of sacks, cartons, and plywood boxes. The column stops for rest and bodily needs, and the feeding of both the hall and the convoyers begins. It is strictly forbidden to stock up on food and contraband and carry it to the camp. Each participant is subjected to body searches before returning to the zone, but the success rate of these searches is low. You can't undress a person in 30-degree frost. The coat is thick, but they grope us without taking off their gloves. How can they determine, for example, that a person's chest and underbelly are covered with slices of lard right on the skin? How can they tell if there is an extra purse with some nutritious contents hanging between the thighs? In short, 12-hour grocery shopping trips were not participated in vain. Much less respected are firewood hikes. Somewhere in the forest, at a distance of 3–5 kilometers from the camp, piled 6-meter sections of trunks of tall pines. In order to bring a good number of these heavyweights to the camp, sled-human columns are made up, and the trunks' lengths are put on 2 sledges, head and tail, 3 or 6 pieces each, depending on what diameter they are. There are up to 20 people in the harness of such a wagon. The road to these stacks of wood stretches across an open field where snowdrifts can be 1½ meters high. Advancement along this road of human traction on a path not cleared in advance requires mobilization of the last forces, and these trips are not without victims. The guys fall down from exhaustion and can't or don't want to get up anymore. We have to allocate 1 sled to return to the camp, those who overestimated their physical strength. But I remembered the advice of a Russian man that bedbugs avoid fresh resinous wood. I ran through the rooms, and, what luck, I found a section where there were newly made 2-tiered bunks with fresh tiers of resin on the boards. I managed to occupy the lower tier and thus ensure myself a quiet night's rest after the roof had been arranged over the upper tier to collect the bombers diving from the ceiling. One of the firm habits of behavior of the bedbugs of that region was to make only 1 free-fall descent from the ceiling in one night. Every morning the descended individuals were swept from this roof, and the attack of these insects was kept within tolerable limits. The schedule of the day of this school proved to be very exacting. From Monday to Saturday, there were 10 hours daily of lectures, seminars, discussions, circles of criticism and self-criticism, special circles for the study of the works of the classics of materialistic philosophy, etc. On Sundays, amateur art and excursions to the surrounding forest, on the way back from which our shoulders were loaded with firewood. The cadets are divided into classes of 20–25 people, Attached to each class is an assistant professor who directs the activities that take place by class. Some assistant professors have immigrant assistants attached to them. The teaching staff is recruited from the recently dissolved Comintern Academy. They are exclusively German émigrés, most of whom fought against Franco in Spain. They belong to the group of the lucky ones who, after Franco's victory, managed to avoid internment in France. The name of an assistant professor in my class, Berngard Kanan, worries me very much. Wasn't he the leader of the communist units, whose direct opponent in his native land was my father, who was a member of the German National Party, which in Parliament was to the right of the Nazis? At the beginning of the first class Kanan, getting acquainted with the students, asks, "Is it possible that my class includes the son of my most violent political opponent, Ernst Fritz, a delegate of the Prussian Parliament?" I had to confirm the correctness of the suspicion. It was felt that Kanan's favouring the son of his worst enemy did not promise good things. There is no concrete evidence, but I think it is him I have to thank for my return from communist delusions to the world of sober reason. Another docent, surname I forget, tells me that he had fights in the Prussian Land Parliament with my father, throwing inkwells. He told me about it with a smile on his face. He's just a man. Kanan, on the other hand, is a party worker. Political work. A short course on the All-Union Communist Party. So we are delving into the ideological world of Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism. I ask the question, why no one mentions Engelsism, while the foundations of dialectical materialism were created mainly by him. Maybe just the sound of Engels' name with ism on the end doesn't fit. This was my first heretical question posed, thank God not to Kanan, but to his assistant. Instead of an answer, a warning not to fool around at seminars. In general, I do not hide the fact that I studied Engels' philosophy with great enthusiasm. Knowledge of dialectics and dialectical materialism gave me useful knowledge for life. With ever-increasing disgust, I studied both the short course of the All-Union Communist Party and the history of the German labour movement. The events described in both the USSR and Germany are replete with the moral and physical murder of those who dare to think in their own way, and, even worse, to spread their thoughts among the people. Study those who are in power and those who seek power. Study well who prevails over whom, and endeavour to propagate the teachings of the prevailing one. Abandon any personal beliefs, speak only in unison with the ruler. Do not hesitate to kill your best friend if the party demands it of you. This is where the chain of my mistakes began. To look at the dirt with open eyes, and at the same time think about purification. This was considered a real hereticism in Stalin's system of oppression of the masses. I personally considered it fair to put into practice the teachings preferably of Engels. The second heretical question I posed to associate Professor Kanan himself. He explained the basic difference between idealism and materialism, the primacy of spirit or matter, told in a motley speech that spirit cannot be touched with the hand or seen with the eyes, determined that spirit is a product of matter, and this is a fact, while the existence of spirit without matter has not been proven by anyone. It must be believed in blindly, as in God. Therefore, idealists are believers. Kanan's reaction to my question, who then created matter, was simply shocking. He was ready to burst with anger, having decided that the question had been asked in order to disrupt the lesson. This offence of mine was discussed in the evening, in a class on criticism and self-criticism. First, Kanan psyched my classmates on me like a pack of dogs. Then he fired words at me like a gun or a cannon. And finally, he made the poor wretch who had been shattered into shreds criticize himself and regret what he had done, which I did to stay alive. After 2 hours of excoriation, the event was summarized in the sense of, have you seen where pickiness in political life leads? This incident forever left a residue at the bottom of my political conscience. After such lessons, I finally came to believe that Hitler was a criminal and that the Nazis' fascist ideology had no human face and therefore did not deserve the right to live. This conviction has persisted to this day, and I am ready to defend it at any moment. Nothing has changed in this after the publication of documents from the Soviet archives, which proved Stalin's intention to attack Germany as treacherously as Hitler did when he attacked the USSR. A knave is no different from a knave. In August 1944, the school zone spread the alarming news that we would go to help in harvesting, but where, it was unknown. We gathered our personal belongings and set off 500 people. The most incomprehensible thing was that leather shoes were taken away and replaced with wooden shoes. In such shoes, they barely walked 45 km along sandy forest roads to Vyazniki station. Those who could no longer walk were loaded on peasant carts after a doctor's order. Most of the guys thought that we were going to a collective or state farm and kept on their feet with all their might. As we approached the city, we heard, "There are no wagons yet. We will have to spend the night in the open air on the bank of Klyazma." We settled down as we could under willows. I built myself a hut and after supper crawled into it and quickly fell asleep. I woke up in complete darkness from the rain, soaked from head to toe. My sleep, no doubt, was deep. Many people were already crowding around a huge fire. The Romanians had made it and were keeping it burning so that they could warm themselves. We don't get along well with the Romanians, but this night they were thanked for their ability to light a fire in the rain. The Germans don't know how to do that. In exchange for a bad night, nature gave us a marvelous sunrise, to which very few of these chilled people paid attention. They didn't appreciate the gift, but I personally was delighted. I admired the landscape of the most skillful artist, nature. The first time it happened to me after the sunrise on the Caspian Sea on June 20, 1943. Fate gave me an amazing ability to forget both illnesses and sufferings at the sight of the beauty of nature. And real life upset everyone. There would be no wagons. We would have to return to the camp. Again, a hard road of 45 km in wooden blocks, a broken hope for work in the fields, for a cheerful competition with local girls. We learned about the purpose of this campaign a week later, when a column of new prisoners of war from Moldavia came to the camp. They had been on the road for a month, fed on whatever they could find, and after feeding on herring there was no water to drink. Out of 1,500 of them, about 500 remained. So maneuvers with us were held to find out whether these disabled people could walk another 45 km. And if the cadets on wooden blocks could cover this distance twice in 2 days, then it would be possible for the weakened, but in leather shoes, to cover it at least once. The calculation was correct, but of the new arrivals, more than one of these sufferers died in the camp hospital. We set off on the road, having no idea how long we had to walk. If it's a long distance, our shoes won't hold up. We crossed the swampy lowlands of the Klyazma River and walked through the forest. We marched the whole day, and only in the evening we see houses and barracks of a large camp. We go through all the necessary procedures: bath, disinfection, removal of the last hair from the body inspection. We lay down on the bunks after midnight. As expected, we got into the quarantine zone together with representatives of different nationalities. Besides Germans, there were Hungarians, Romanians, Italians, and a small number of young men from almost all countries of Europe, who served as volunteers mainly in the SS troops. In the quarantine zone, it was boring. There was nothing to do. Talking all day long, or as the Germans say, poking holes in the air, gets tiresome after a while. My curiosity is aroused by the appearance of an officer who is looking for volunteers to unload barges at a nearby wharf. I eagerly joined the circle of willing participants. According to my experience in military captivity, I knew that volunteers are those who prefer to spend their time at work, not idle and constantly waiting for food. In good spirits and even with songs, we set off along the forest trail in a column of about 100 men. Our appearance was not important. Many had ragged clothes, shoes in a deplorable condition, some walked in laptoes. We approached a small village. Here children appear, shouting on the run Fritzes, Hans, old women come out of the houses. Look at this crowd of human misfortune and tears flow down their cheeks. This is the Russian soul. It may be that a husband or son fell at the front from the line of this very German, who passes before their eyes and they pity him. Only now I met a demonstration of compassion for a prisoner of war. But in time we have become accustomed to such signs of pity. I was deeply impressed by the fact that almost all the members of the group were affected by this behavior of the women. Such a demonstration of sympathy was more often than not ignored. It is hard to say where to look for the reason for this collective reaction. Maybe it was the fact that this group was a group of volunteers, a clot of heightened mental sensitivity and receptivity. Finally, we arrived at the bank of the Klyazma River near the town of Uj. The coastal strip is a wide meadow with lush greenery. There is a long tent on the meadow, 2 rows of straw mattresses, and a blanket for each occupant. Next to it is a small tent for the kitchen. There is no fence. The guards warn us not to try to hide in the woods. The kitchen is already working, so the supply staff has arrived before us. The quality of the evening soup helps to lift our spirits even despite the fact that we have walked about 20 kilometers through the forest sandy trails in broken shoes and are quite tired, however. We absorb with pleasure both the beauty of nature and the signs of thoughtful care for the good of volunteers. Our main difficult job is unloading barges arriving from the south with bales of raw cotton. The weight of such a bale, as I remember, about 150 kilograms. These bales have to be first rolled from the cargo hold to the board, then from the board to the shore, and then stacked in a stack, which is rapidly growing. There are no cries of come on faster. We work in a friendly manner, and our superiors are obviously ready to objectively assess the efficiency of our efforts. At lunchtime and in the evenings, the camp staff, like a herd of cows, wanders around the meadow. They grow edible herbs, which are so necessary to compensate for winter vitamin deficiency. We eat a lot of sorrel and wild onions. From time to time, one of the guards makes a detour along the coastal strip and almost politely warns those who are too far from the center of our camp. The difference in living conditions between the previous camps and this paradise place has a very positive effect on the psyche of the guys. The work goes on. Accompanied by friendly roll call, cooks justify themselves by cooking delicious dishes. In the evening we light a fire around which we sit, talking and joking. German folk songs are not infrequently heard, sung by the wharf management staff present. Most of those present are in captivity for the second year and for the first time, after a period of great suffering and deprivation, are returning to normal living conditions. On one of the first days of this business trip, I am sitting alone on the bank of the Klasma River in the evening, immersed in dreams of spring in my homeland. A middle-aged woman approaches, obviously a gypsy, and without ceremony greets me and sits down beside me. She addresses me with a rapid-fire stream of words, the meaning of which I try to guess. She takes my hand and looks at the open palm with interest. It seems that this fortune-teller is so unskilled that she thinks I am Russian, or at least Soviet. I start talking in my Russian, and now it's her turn to be surprised. We start talking about this and that, and she won't stop holding and examining my hand. Here I hear a prediction that I won't forget until death, which will come to me no sooner than 2023. Hey, she says, what a long lifeline you have. You have 100 years to live, and what a lucky man you are. Happiness is always with you, but don't forget that your happiness will often be in rescue from misfortune, the only way out of which is to go to the other world. There, the Oracle of the South is mine. The situation of the fatal raid on the Caspian merchant fleet comes before my eyes. The devastating hit of a flak shell in a strafing flight over the water, according to the laws of physics, is tantamount to a death sentence for the crew of the affected airplane. What about us? We made a soft landing on the water, caught in the hands of angry husbands and fathers of women and children killed by our bombs, and I, along with 2 comrades, survived. What is this? Isn't this the embodiment of what the gypsy woman just told me on the palm of her hand? She didn't lie about happiness. I've lived a happy life ever since, with many different kinds of happiness. Remember my thought about a piece of bread, which can also be the cause of great happiness? In this respect, the fortune teller, was right. Why not believe her and her predestination? And so I lived until I was 75 years old, not having learned until now what it is, fear of death. I am destined to live for another 25 years. I am grateful to this unknown fortune-teller with whom we met on the river Kliazma. There is another reason to thank her. Instead of taking money for a favor, she bought from me a leather wallet for the price of 2 kilograms of potatoes. This transaction ended in a material situation improved considerably when a barge with wheat arrived, and we were invited to unload it in our spare time. We volunteered with great willingness because the cooks could make something edible out of the wheat. We got down to work, and the transportation of grain to the left was organized as follows. Our restroom was on the shore behind the kitchen of our camp. Naturally, a certain contingent of guys had to go there regularly. They tied the lower ends of their pants above their ankles and filled the bags formed in this way with wheat. Those who left hid themselves from the gaze of the watching personnel by passing the kitchen tent, where the cooks stood at the ready to dump the golden cargo into suitable containers. In this way 2 sacks of wheat grain were collected in one shift. But the cooks found themselves at a dead end. There was no mill, and all the auxiliary mechanisms invented by comrades did not give the desired effect. They boiled the grain with spices and herbs for 8 hours straight. The grain softened a lot. The porridge of this kind was handed out as a supplement. The guy sat chewing like cows and swallowing this valuable nutritious thing in more or less large portions. The result was horrifying. The grain swelled in the stomach, causing terrible pain. People suffered the more they ate this dangerous porridge. It must be considered a miracle that only one young man died from this mat. A heavy price was paid for stealing grain. Events took a completely different course when a barge with potatoes arrived at the wharf. The wharf authorities again invited prisoners of war to unload it, precisely because they were not so much able to steal as the civilian population. The bosses offered an in-kind reward of 2 sacks of potatoes per shift. Such a quantity ensured our complete satiety and spared us the need to steal. There were 100 labourers working on the barge, and the loss was no more than 100 kg of product. 4 weeks of this business trip passed too quickly. We would have lived in these conditions all summer. On the 1st of June, we settled down in the school zone to replace the graduate cadets who had departed in different directions. The dormitories in 2-story log houses differed by the fact that a separate room accommodated no more than 12 people, with soft mattresses, pillows, blankets, tables, chairs, benches, but there was one, bedbugs. They greeted us with whole armies, well fed with the blood of departing cadets. Pull up the mattress and admire the iridescent brownish-brown colours of the solid covering of the boards. Despair gripped me. How can one live as a feeder for such herds of bedbugs? We summoned those who wished to come to the dining hall, recited poems by heart, told stories, performed entertainers imbued with humour, sang songs, and at the same time cautiously hinted at the strategy and tactics of preserving life by mobilizing psychic forces. The camp authorities allowed the organization of estradas of that primitive type, but also did not forget about the supervision of the activities of the dystrophics. They delegated to the zone a member of the anti-fascist activists, whose residence was in the work zone of the camp. In addition, the head of the Soviet political department at that moment guessed that among the dystrophics there were such Germans who had agreed in advance to participate in the course of the anti-fascist school. He summoned the prospective cadets, including myself, and explained to the surprised listeners that they were morally obliged to provide active assistance in restoring their comrades' health. He explained that the Soviet government, in a difficult military situation, was not ready or even able to feed the mass of German prisoners of war for free for a long time. The tone of this instruction was not very friendly, but rather a threat. If you do not work, we will not feed you. One of the desirable results of the intervention of higher authorities was that a guitar was allocated to the recuperation zone. It didn't take long to find a guitarist singer, and as soon as he began to sing a song with a guitar in the corridor, people began to crowd around him. They got up from their bunks, forgot about their seemingly hopeless situation for minutes, and many of them cried. Quite a few comrades from the sphere of depressives and culinary artists began to join the active organizers and performers of amateur art. It would be a mistake to think that enthusiasm embraced the entire personnel. A group emerged that boycotted all activities and threatened activists with punitive measures in the future, but this was a minority. Most people welcomed, or at least allowed without protest, what was being done to lift the spirits of the people. The success of the cause was in danger of failure when, at the behest of the chief of the political department, the activists were issued a special ration. Soup and porridge half as much as the ration prescribed for ordinary dystrophics. It is clear that additional products for the realization of this privilege are not given to the kitchen. It means that the increase of the food ration for activists is carried out at the expense of the rest of the comrades. Besides, a special table was set aside for activists in the field of vision of the whole public of the canteen. Dreading the increased portion of soup, it is embarrassing to look into the eyes of those who received the standard ration. A dispute rises among the members of the activists. Some defend the position that the activist is supposedly doing important work, while the rest of us are waiting for results without doing anything. Their argument reads, "Production workers are entitled to extra rations for fulfilling norms. Why should we refuse such a benefit?" Others suspect a kind of bribery under the slogan, "Porridge for supporting the enemy." Until the dispute is resolved, all members of the activists, including myself, take a seat at the table where the cook gives the due supplement. Sin in the name of comforting animal passions. To this day, I am ashamed to remember that deviation from the norms of social decency, but later I had to be convinced that bribery with foodstuffs and compromising the bribed person in front of society was one of the standard techniques in the psychological struggle of the Gulag personnel with the subordinate prisoners. In early April, during the next commissioning, about 3/4 of the former dystrophics were recognized fit for light work. They made up an echelon which included residents of the working zone, 200 people in total. With this transport I left Krasnoarmysk forever. When for the withdrawal gathered at the camp's gatehouse, it was warm. The sun was shining and the general mood of the people seemed elevated. The column moved on its way, someone began to sing a song and many people picked it up. We were taken by electric train to the partially restored main station of Stalingrad. Passing the station Bekatovka, we saw a boundless field, on which piles were piled the remains of downed and crashed German airplanes. My heart squeezed at the sight of those remains of the pride of our aviation. A large number of fuselages left intact, people adapted for housing. We lined up on the square in front of the station and went to the river station, not straight ahead, but took us around the city, or rather, what was left of it. It was scary to look at this sea of ruins. For the first time in my life I met with such consequences of battles. While I was at home in Germany, I did not have time to visit the areas destroyed by the Allied bombs. The horrifying picture of the city was, of course, stunning, but all our thoughts were occupied with the hope of resettlement in a new camp with better living conditions. This hope lifted our spirits, and we began to sing songs again. The purpose of the trip was a collective farm behind the Aktuba. They feed well there, reports one of the janitors. So how can we not raise our heads and look confidently into the future? It is appropriate to point out that even during Stalin's lifetime, the medals depicting the fathers of communism had Stalin in the same row with the dead. Party members and mere students had to study the writings and dogmas of these four in the most serious manner. I apologize for getting ahead of myself, as we are still near Stalingrad and sailing on a steamer on the Aktuba. The sun is warming, the sky is blue, the clouds are white, the shores are covered with the first green, in a word, spring, and all participants of this excursion are excitedly waiting for the answer to the question where we are being taken. A small village on the eastern shore, a primitive pier. We go ashore, and we are greeted by a group of Romanians who have prepared accommodation for us. Winter army tents placed over square pits of about 4 meters. There is no fence. We are welcomed with lunch, the quality of which deserves a rating of sufficient. Nearby there are more excavations, apparently for dugouts. Our task is to pull the logs out of the Volga water, split them in half with wedges, trim them and submit them for installation of dugouts. The work is not very hard. We are fed tolerably well, and around in the meadows we can find a lot of useful greens and roots. Again, Romanian gypsies teach us to use for food frogs, snakes and other animals that fall into the excavations and have nowhere to run. In the morning, when the column leaves for work, the critter hunters run downstairs to the scolding of the escorts and collect anything that moves. At lunchtime we light fires and prepare a supplement for lunch. Here, of course, is paradise compared to Krasnoarmysk, so the mood of the guys is not bad. There is no reason to complain. I remember one event that made us very excited. In the evening, after the inspection, the medical staff appeared and the doctor explained that they were going to vaccinate against typhoid, paratyphoid and cholera. We should all take off our shirts and get an injection of the vaccine. No one was worried and everyone heroically endured the injections. But at night the pain started, the temperature rose, some more, some less, and panic set in. There was an opinion that the Russians were allegedly conducting experiments on us, trying medical drugs on living organisms. There were cases of loss of consciousness. Many people could not lift their arms because of severe pain. At the checkup, the doctor tried to explain that this was a normal reaction of the organism to the vaccine, just a non-acute course of the disease. However, the grumbling did not subside. We were not taken to work. We lay and waited for what would happen next. But by the evening the news about the improvement of the condition went around the camp. The night passed quietly, and the next day no less than 90 of the staff were recognized as able to work. My stay in this camp was short. By the end of April a group of future cadets was gathered and led directly to the Stalingrad railway station. There they were joined by guys from other Legot departments, 30 people in total. In a passenger carriage they went to Moscow. 2 sergeants were assigned to guard, who were not supposed to allow the civilian population to communicate with the prisoners. But the organization of transport was not fully thought out. We rode in a wagon, which was in the middle of the train, and who will be able to stop the movement of passengers back and forth? And there was a rumor that a whole bunch of Germans were riding nearby, furious. The convoyers tried with great zeal not to let the passengers pass, but their loud shouts, "You can't, citizens. There is no passage. We're not successful. It is impossible to guard the entrance for a whole day," and the sergeants gave in. Lively conversations began, then with hands and feet, then in a fairly decent Russian language. Someone managed to offer for sale the available valuables, and the secret trade began. We must not, dear reader, forget that all this happened in April 1944. There was still a fierce battle at the front, and here in a passenger train the captured opponents are quietly travelling, and nobody threatens them with a fist. They try to have a conversation, maybe not friendly, but quite human. There is something to be surprised. Transfer from one station to another in Moscow. For the first time we see the Moscow subway. We admire the luxury of station decoration, and again we are surprised that at our appearance on people's faces there is only curiosity and no anger and hatred. From Kazansky station we set off eastward. Night comes and I quickly fall asleep lying on the bottom shelf. I wake up from a woman's whispering. There is no light in the carriage, I can hardly orient myself. Finally, it turns out that the conversation is going on under my bench. I finally wake up and intervene in the conversation with a polite greeting. It turns out that there, under the bench, lie a mother and daughter. The mother fortune teller very trustingly tells me that she went to Moscow with her daughter to guess by hand a bazaars, having neither documents nor a pass. To be caught on a long-distance train is inevitably connected with trouble, and she, a cunning woman, decided to go under the guard of the military in the car, where no one about passes and will not ask about passes. The morning came and we all got off the train at Vyazniki station. Mother and daughter disappeared into the crowd, waving goodbye to. The records were kept as a treasure, and the members of the circles emphasized again and again that this treasure would definitely be brought home. The expert-type circle differed from the lecture-type circle only, in that the former lacked an assistant professor. The participants considered themselves experts on the subject, and each of them in turn, or in chorus with others, revealed the secrets of their professional achievements. In the Corps of Dystrophics, accordingly, a university was established, the names of the faculties of which were as follows: the preparation of hot and cold dishes, preparation of bakery and confectionery products, preparation of alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages. Up here are the notes of trainees and experts. The hidden purpose of the classes is to comfort the stomach's demand for increased rations of nutrients through the mental preparation and consumption of imaginary foods. In addition to theoretical or academic classes, found fans of practical cooking exercises. The task is to prepare beautiful culinary products from the products given out in the canteen. The first and difficult task is to smuggle these products out of the canteen. During breakfast, lunch and dinner in the canteen, there was always a doctor or nurse on duty, who with an eagle eye made sure that the Germans ate soup with bread and left the room without food. It was forbidden to accumulate food in order to eat enough at least once a day. The feeling of hunger prevented one from falling asleep, and a captive's feeling of hunger occurred regardless of the fact that the caloric content of the rations was quite sufficient. The mere fact that no amount of effort can get you extra food is enough to create a feeling of hunger. Amateurs of practical cookery devise all sorts of methods to hide the contraband from the eyes of the medical staff. Success justifies the means, and their success rate is high. Bread, porridge, and non-liquid parts of the soup are used as starting points for the creation of artistic culinary products, which are skillfully fished out of the cauldron in front of the staff. Returning from the dining room to the living quarters, the artist prepares his workplace. He takes out a board, a glass, a homemade knife and fork, and gets to work. He slices bread, spreads them out, and spreads them with the filling components, putting layer upon layer and decorating the final product with an open-work pattern. The work is finished. The artist admires the result of his work and hides it until all the neighbours have eaten the last piece of smuggled bread. After making sure that the last of his comrades has already stopped chewing, he puts the product of his efforts on the table and, using fork and knife, as at a festival banquet, gives himself up to the pleasure of tasting under the jealous gazes of the neighbouring tenants. There are many such artists in the corps. They even began to organise competitions under the slogan for the most beautiful bread cake, a mineral characteristic of such and similar occupations. Remoteness from reasonable reality, deepening into a fictitious world with a deficit of training of both sober mind and organs of movement, which did not contribute at all to the acceleration of the process of recovery. The Soviet camp authorities faced the difficult question of how to deal with the mental component of dystrophy, the existence of which they eventually became convinced. Even the medical staff, as it seemed to us, I had no relevant experience. After a month, it became apparent that the dystrophics had not recovered according to plan. I can imagine that among the responsible Soviet personnel the following opinion was formed. Damn Krauts, we release them from work, provide them with warmth and comfort, give them better rations than the civilian population, and what else do they lack? They do not want to restore their ability to work, they sabotage our activities. The High Command demands to restore the health of these bastards. We spoil them. But what do? They are fooling around. They like to do nothing. It is clear that on such thoughts and fears, hatred and a desire to show who has the tools of power should grow. Soberly analysing this situation, some of the residents of the dystrophic corps, including myself, came to the conclusion that it will be even worse if it is not possible to organise a radical turnaround. But who among this heap of human ruins would be able to reason soberly and develop a set of measures to lead people out of the deadlock? Who among the German prisoners of war could dare to assist the camp commanders, i.e., the enemy, in the reproduction of the labour force for the strengthening of war production? On the other hand, the laws of humanity ordered that something be done to prevent such a reaction of the authorities as might lead to the inevitable death of all the dystrophics. It seemed so to me. Among the dystrophics of that period in the Krasnoarmeyski camp were such intelligent and experienced Krauts who were seriously discussing the question, what is to be done? For what reasons I, a young, inexperienced fellow, was drawn into the circle of these wise men, I cannot say. The only gift that could catch the eye of a psychologically educated person was my optimism and my ability to smile and laugh in this difficult environment. The circle of wise men were trying to solve a question that can be summarized as follows. There is a war going on. Compatriots are dying on the front. The more casualties will be, the more the enemy's military power will be strengthened. Consequently, any action of ours in favour of the enemy leads to additional casualties of ours at the front. To speed up the recovery of dystrophics is an indirect action in favour of the enemy, since any labour force strengthens his military power. On the other hand, if the matter is left to its own devices, it is possible that the enemy will decide not to invest any more capital in dystrophics and will write them off completely. The decision process was greatly influenced by reports about the activities of the Union of German Officers, aimed, in short, at declaring invalid the military oath taken by Hitler, the commander-in-chief of the German troops. In addition, an article by a group of officers led by General Seydlitz appeared in a prisoner of war newspaper, in which they called for resistance against Hitler's autocracy with the argument, the sooner the war ends, the fewer casualties there will be. Only a blind man can believe in a German victory over the Allies. As a result of such propaganda, the willingness of the majority of the circle of wise men to recognize the war as lost very slowly but steadily developed. Arguments such as, if even our generals call for action against the Nazi top brass, why should the common soldier abide by the moral code of honor of a dying army? Were heard more and more often. Still, there was still a struggle between honor and patriotism on one side and the duty of humanity on the other. There is a circle of supporters of the humane option one. Discussed the question of what methods in this situation can be lifted people from their beds and raise their morale. They created physical training and amateur art circles. There were propagandists who tried to enlighten the comrades in the direction that the only way home, to the motherland, goes through the strengthening of confidence and health. Everything was clear in theory, but how could the theory be put into practice when there were no material resources for it? No books in German, no materials or tools for art classes, no musical instrument. The only resources at the moment were a checkers, chess and the memory records of individual comrades. The manner in which this examination is conducted is not very flattering to the dignity of the individual. In a large room or hall sits a medical commission consisting of 2 military doctors and the commandant of the camp or his designee. The prisoners are called in brigade by brigade. They must undress completely and stand before the commission one by one. The members of the commission determine the first 4 categories by sight, as in the slave market. Distinguishing the 3 degrees of dystrophy is a more delicate matter. The doctor uses his thumb and forefinger to pull back the skin somewhere on the ribs, so that a fold about 3-4 centimeters high is formed. Releasing this fold determines the duration of the skin smoothing process. If 2-3 seconds, then dystrophy I, 3-5 seconds, dystrophy I, and over 5 seconds, dystrophy II. I will not vouch for the absolute correctness of the seconds, but there could be personal considerations on this characteristic of different doctors. I passed the medical examination, and the result was dystrophy II with weight of 46 kg. And a miracle happened. Dystrophics were concentrated in a special building and began to feed us approximately according to the norms, to which I had easily got used to near Astrakhan. Before the housewarming we underwent bath and disinfection, received clean underwear and dew. What happiness! A blanket for the night. The bunks had mattresses and sheets. Another miracle. The bedbug population in this building was negligible. It was hard to believe that life had moved from the threshold of hell to paradise. Thanks to the General's Commission, new officers arrived to replace the command staff. Exclusively invalids who had fought at the front and could not fight any more. There was no reason to complain about their treatment of prisoners until I left Stalingrad. April 1944. Dystrophy in the life of the average European of our days. This concept is absent because it is practically unheard of. But look at the photos of Hitler's concentration camps, taken at the moment of liberation of prisoners by the Allies in April-May 1945, or video reports, taken already in our days in South Sudan, speaking about starvation death of the population. This is the outward appearance of dystrophy. Photographs or other images of dystrophic prisoners of war in Soviet camps are probably nowhere to be found. But the symptoms of this anteroom to hell are the same, regardless of place and time. The person looks like a walking skeleton covered with flaccid and wrinkled skin. One could, as they say, hang a hat on the pelvic bones. The outlines of the teeth are visible through the sunken cheeks. The cheekbones rise with sharp ridges, the nostrils are abnormally enlarged, and the eyes without luster radiate a dull expression. No muscles are visible on the limbs, nor on the chest or back. Just bones covered in dried skin. It is unclear where the exhausted body gets the energy to move its arms and legs. In the first 2 years of the war, the dystrophic's position amounted to a death sentence. According to the practice of the Gulag, everyone was driven to work until a person died. The way to the grave was short, and there was no time and no one to leave to historians and writers information about his mental and psychological state. I am well aware of the fate of hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers who in 1941-42 died in German captivity in the same conditions as the Germans in the first months after the Battle of Stalingrad. I will describe what happened within my narrow field of vision. I will not describe everything in dark colours, because in the Red Army camp in 1944, a health zone for dystrophics was organised and the mortality rate dropped to 0. The general mood gradually rose. I want to tell about those who in the most difficult moments did not lose hope to survive and return to their homeland. I belong to such people. We found brothers in spirit, and a centre of adherence of an optimistic outlook on life was organised. In my life I was fortunate in that I was captured as a perfectly healthy boy and not before the middle of 1943. And besides, I avoided long railroad transportation, where many died of hunger and thirst. The consciousness of the officers and junior staff of the Maya troops was changing slowly. On the one hand, the slogans "Kill the German wherever he meets," and on the other hand, orders about humane treatment of captive Kroats. It's hard to understand the need to feed the Nazis when we don't have enough ourselves. But I was lucky. Having got rid of dystrophy, I got into the band of measures to save the life of German prisoners as a labour force to supply the front and restore the destroyed economy in the country. In Krasnoyarsk, after the arrival of the new command from the disabled of the war markedly improved and reached the stomachs of the proper nutrition. The medical commission determined the condition of everyone. Dystrophics were released from going to work, gave increased nutrition, and the building where they were, fenced off from the work area. Why a prison within a prison? It was to prevent the exchange of food for tobacco in Mahorka from the work zone. The command was interested in the speedy recovery of the labour force. These measures were not taken without reason. There was indeed trade of this type. But man is not a mechanism whose efficiency can be improved by food, rest, good sanitary conditions. Boredom and ennui is a dangerous enemy of health. Checkers and chess are not enough to raise the tone of 250 exhausted men. A certain part of the men saw no way out and were deeply depressed. They spent their time lying on their bunks in silence. Even to the canteen they were taken by force, and they reasoned as follows. Why get better? Let them finish with us as soon as possible. The superiors had no time to deal with mental illnesses. Therefore, we had to organize help for this group by our own efforts. There was a category of storytellers. They would gather, sitting on their bunks, 3-5 people at a time, and begin to remember the shelling, hunger, cold, the Battle of Stalingrad and the surrender of the Sixth Army. This constant bathing in suffering is not conducive to a speedy recovery. There are storytellers among the storytellers. They didn't see it themselves, but they add a lot. Immobility, focusing thoughts on the past, waiting for food 3 times a day, that's all their lives were limited to. I got acquainted with another group of more life-loving people, those who believe in the victory of Hitler's Germany. They make predictions, analyze the reasons for failure, still waiting for the appearance of newly formed German troops. With surprise, I realized that there are almost no accounts of heroic episodes of individual soldiers and the exploits of individual units and troops, and this was undoubtedly in the terrible defensive battles in the encirclement. Doubts have arisen. Maybe none of the heroes survived. The thought came to me that the catastrophe of the first months of captivity and the last battles was mainly borne by those who fought away from the front line, closer to the storehouse. It is only clear that the real heroes were silent. The groups characterized above included about 1/3 of the dystrophic population. Another virus of mental delusion was rampant among the rest of the residents of the health building, manifesting itself in a variety of symptoms. There were spontaneously assembled amateur clubs of different genres, which continued daily from breakfast to lunch, from lunch to dinner, and from dinner to evening dawn. There were lecture-type circles and expert circles. The external appearance of a lecturer's circle is as follows. 10 people sit on 2 neighbouring bunks, listening to the lecturer's report with concentration and a twinkle in their eyes, taking notes and occasionally discussing the topic in lively debates. The listeners are equipped with writing utensils of all kinds. There are feathers from large birds and ink made from pharmaceuticals. Pencil sticks no more than 10 to 20 millimeters long. Paper of different origin, for example, from packs of flap paper, from the edges of newspapers, from paper groats bags, the back of the last unsigned letter from the wife or mother, and even the back of photographs of relatives, photographs which as a rule were not taken away during the captivity. Plywood boards were used instead of paper. As often happened, we returned late from the factory and the doctor was gone. When on the 3rd day I got an appointment at the outpatient clinic, I could hardly keep on my feet. I got a certificate and cold pills, but the result of therapy was deplorable. I spent several days in the duty room of the corps and successfully trained 100-meter run down and up the icy slope. But the athletic effect of such training was modest because the distance run was measured in minutes, not seconds. Whether I ate anything during these days, I forget. It was impossible to think about any diet. How many days had passed since the first intake was also erased from my memory. In the end, I reached that level of existence, which was promised to me by the senior German corps on the day of my arrival in this camp. I remember his greeting verbatim. Pilot, by the looks of you, you have spent the last months in a resort. I promise that you will not be different from the rest of the people in the camp very soon. Says he, Staffenfeldbilskerderin, had obviously been watching me and told me to bring me to the hospital after this prophecy had been carried out. The wards in the camp hospital were heated, and the temperature was kept above 10 degrees. The beds were separate. On their bottoms of planks there were mats of burlap, but no blankets, 1 sheet per patient. Before settling in the ward I had a bath, what happiness, and a weighing. The residual weight was 46 kg with the initial weight of 72. The patients were given food according to the increased norm, but in the first days I did not want to eat. The boredom of existence on the bunk did not make me depressed, thank God. Yosif, a Jew who served in the Hungarian army, was in charge of order in our ward. His main task was to take out the excrement tanks, pour the contents into the sewer, clean the tanks and return them to the corridor in front of the ward. There was no bathroom in the hospital according to today's concepts, barely keeping on my feet. I tried to help Yosif with this nasty job, which I eventually took over completely. Yosif managed special food sources, at the expense of which he fed me in gratitude for my help. This, I believe, is one of the reasons why the devil hasn't finally taken me to hell yet. The hospital's senior female doctor, a Jewish woman named Greenstein, appreciated the work of Yosif, a brother in faith, and gave her consent when Yosef suggested that she appoint me as an auxiliary orderly. Instead of being released from the hospital, I was put on the roster of the attendants of that section of the camp. Now I slept in the corridor very near the notorious tanks and the sick, would wake me up on their way to the tanks 5 times a night. What a pleasant life when there was alternating frost and thaw, snow and rain. But I didn't enjoy this paradisiacal life for long. The same Shirlene who had ordered me to be taken to the hospital sick found me and got me back to work in the repair shop. The death rate among the prisoners of war in camp? No. 181 in December and January rose to unprecedented heights. The exact figures did not reach us, ordinary prisoners. But according to rumours, the decrease in the list of prisoners of war was equal to about 1/3 of the original number from the fall of 1943. By internal organs, especially the liver and the engine of blood circulation, the heart, were failing more and more noticeably in their normal function. Swelling appeared terrible. During the working shift I constantly stood for 9–10 hours, plus the march from the camp to the factory and back, 2 hours. In the evening my shins swelled and their diameter increased to the point that it was impossible to take off my pants. We had to lie down with our legs up. Then, after half an hour, the swelling moved to the head with the result that the face took on an optical resemblance to the full moon. Many comrades, including myself, were on the threshold of hell. It was no longer a question of whether to go or not to go, but only when. When a person dares to go down into the garbage pit in search of a whole fish head, when a person is ready to extract the last edible fibres from such a head, when a person hunts for waste from mechanical potato peeling, then there is nowhere lower to fall. I confess that I have become acquainted with the inside of a garbage pit and have eaten the remains of potato peelings fried in machine oil. The respected reader may object that, say, the specialists of the Rembaza received a kilogram of bread per day. It is really strange that the guys could not get better on such rations. The daily portion of bread was distributed in the morning in one piece. Another reason, besides bread, only hot water was given. The consequences of such one-sided feeding will be described in detail in another chapter. A commission is a group of people headed by a chairman, which meets on the occasion of an event, investigates the facts, comes to a conclusion, and draws up a report signed by all members and the chairman. This is how one could abstractly define the meaning of this concept in Soviet times. In terms of practical results, the commission could be desirable and undesirable for those who were the subject. The prisoners of war themselves were primarily concerned with 2 types of commissions, which I first encountered during this period. Firstly, the commission from Moscow, as we found out later, appeared in the camp when the actual attrition of the list of prisoners exceeded some permissible norm, or if the labour indicators did not meet expectations. It seemed to us that the authorities of each camp were obliged to send a statistical report to the higher authorities on a regular basis, by the indicators of which it was possible to judge about the living conditions in the camp. What mechanism of action was set in motion when the normal regime was violated? We were not destined to know, but we were usually concerned with the last step in the functioning of this mechanism. Such an institution already existed in Tsarist Russia, but it was not called a commission but an auditor. It used to happen that a group of foreign officers appeared in the camp, and the camp commanders were nervous. Then it disappeared completely, or individuals from it, and their place was taken by new people. After such a change, the living conditions in the camp usually changed for the better and remained at that level for a long time. A commission headed by a general came to Krasnoarmeysk in early February 1944. The camp authorities were warned about it in advance because for several days before his arrival there was a real emergency in the camp. Whole brigades were running to all corners of the camp zone, removing garbage, cleaning the latrines, washing the floors in all the buildings, etc. The general arrived at lunchtime and rushed to the kitchen, where the Russian chief of supplies invited the auditor to taste the soup cooked in the cauldrons. One of the German cooks, who spoke Russian to some extent, heard what the general replied to him. I have no doubt that the soup today is tasty and nutritious, and what was in the cauldrons before, I can see by the condition of the crowds. I can't vouch for the fact that the general said it verbatim, but I think it was meant that way. Rumours on this subject spread through the camp like a storm. Hopes grew like flowers under the spring sun, and we did not hope in vain. The next morning at the inspection it was announced that there would be no withdrawal until the commission had formulated its conclusions. The purpose of this inspection was to determine the physical condition of each individual camp resident and to divide the composition into so-called categories. The first category, fully healthy people with strong bodies, fit for any heavy work up to 10 hours a day. Second category, Healthy individuals with less strong bodies, suitable for less heavy work up to 10 hours a day. Category 3. People with signs of exhaustion, but suitable for light work of no more than 6. Okay. People with more obvious signs of emaciation not suitable for industrial work, used for light work inside the camp for no more than 4 hours a day. Dystrophy with 3 degrees, completely unfit for work. Emaciated, thin, with more or less developed muscular atrophy. A few days before the holiday, I managed to sell a kitchen knife and a homemade frying pan at the Rembaza. In order to accumulate food for the holiday dinner, I got a steel box with a screw-top lid, the contents of which no one knew anything about. The contents of the box were a kilogram of bread, a small herring, and a piece of lard. The box was hidden in the bookcase of the library. It was December 24th. In the last days there was a thaw. It rained or snowed. The dirt road between the camp and the shipyard seemed like a wide strip of mushy mud. Tanks from the Rimbaza drove along this road to the steppe to test the cannons. Under their tracks, there was a close mixing of clay and water. It was possible to walk on foot, only on narrow embankments on both sides of the roadbed. Already at the morning withdrawal, the column stretched for at least a kilometre, because it was impossible to go in columns of 4. Convoys were nervous, shouting, but they could not run back and forth, as there was only one narrow path for walking like a breakwater in a sea of mud. Both in the morning on withdrawal and in the evening on returning to camp, darkness reigned. Both we and the escorts could barely navigate by some road lighting lamps. The shift was over, and the brigades gathered in formation to return to the camp. This is where the downpour comes upon us, due to the fact that the air temperature is approaching 0. The result of wetting our clothes, which are not protected from drenching, is difficult to bear. The column densely balances on the trail beside bottomless mud. There is no possibility to get away from this canvas, because on one side there is a huge puddle, and on the other side, mud like a black swamp. We are approaching a small bridge over a stream. The canvas of the bridge rises half a metre above the puddles of thick mud, formed on both sides as a result of digging tank tracks. I approach the bridge, and at that moment a tank approaches at high speed. By the look of it, it is not a tank, but a speedboat or torpedo boat, its bow wave-tossed above its command bridge. At the sight of a column of prisoners of war, the tanker increases his speed to the maximum, and the whole column, including the convoyers, is covered with a thick layer of road mud. This gravy is especially rich for those who stand close to the bridge, where the tank, as from a springboard, rises into the air and after a free flight with a thud slams into a puddle in its deepest place. And there I am, it's Christmas. Between the Rimbaza and the camp there is a railroad line, on which at minute intervals echelons with military equipment from the US through Iran and the Caspian Sea go to the front. Putting the barrier at the crossing is opened only on demand, relatively quickly in the morning when taking us out to work, and rather reluctantly in the evening when we are pulled by the camp after work. Today, December 24, 1943. The sequence of freight trains is so dense that the railroad worker on duty does not dare to open the barrier to let a long column of prisoners of war through. We are just standing there. Flakes of snow mix with the rain, and eventually the precipitation turns to snow. The temperature drops below 0, the wet mud on our clothes freezes. The wind rises, and we stand for half an hour and a half. Finally, the barrier rises, and the air vibrates with the shouts of the escorts. Come on, let's run. We arrived at the site in front of the camp's gatehouse. The convoyers, soaked and soiled as much as we are replaced, and the officer on duty begins to determine the size of the team. Checking any person who has been in a Soviet military captivity recalls this word with fear. They count the number of prisoners at the morning check, at the withdrawal from the camp to work, at the return of work teams to the camp, and at the evening check. All this is not very scary in a small camp where the presence of 100-200 prisoners is checked. It is also bearable at the checkpoint, when the brigades are approaching at intervals. And in our column there are about 500-600 people without division into brigades, after suffering on the road. Everyone's mood has reached boiling point. It is difficult to line up such a crowd in such an order that would enable one to count with accuracy. The duty officer with the count in his hands runs back and forth, counts, and the result does not correspond to the list composition. The whole column is covered with snow. There is shouting and swearing all around. one can cry. An extra hour passes while we are allowed through the gate. We are not allowed into the building because it is time to get dinner. We stand in line in front of the kitchen. Heading towards the enclosure, we eat a piece of fish and drink hot water. Everybody has only one desire: to get into the modest coziness of the corpse, to take off the frozen outer clothes, to clean face and hands, to get warm with the heat output of our gasoline lamps. We entered the building, and we hear the signal for the evening check. The duty officer has the end of the shift at 8 o'clock in the evening, and the time is almost 10 o'clock. The crowd of sufferers from the corpse returns to the courtyard. The wind has turned into a blizzard, the snow is falling in thick masses, and we are lined up in front of the corpse for inspection. The difficulty of checking the list of prisoners of war with the available ones is that a certain number of privileged prisoners of war have the right to stay at the place of work or residence during the inspection. These are cooks, doctors, orderlies, storekeepers, and other officials. When the bulk of the camp's inhabitants are lined up in the yard, the duty officer runs through the positions where he has a list of people he is supposed to have on duty. Having counted this type of population, he approaches the formation and counts the ranks. The total must correspond to the list. But he sums it up by means of a counting thing, holding this thing in his hands, running from place to place, and easily one of the balls can move in the wrong direction. In addition, there are idiots among us who run back and forth behind the hornets, thus increasing the probability of failure of the check, the result of which gives then plus or minus of some number. Christmas. 4 hours have passed since the end of the shift. The duty officer is completely confused. He repeated the count for the third time, and the list does not add up. The first comrades faint. The camp hospital orderlies carry them to the medical station. Both prisoners and representatives of the superiors are running everywhere. The duty officer finally realizes that in such conditions the check cannot give the right result. The time is 11 o'clock in the evening. Once in 6 years of military captivity, I had a chance to experience a fruitless check. It was in the holy evening of 1943 in Krasnoyarsk, near Stalingrad. The duty officer surrendered, reported to the camp commandant, and the latter agreed to release the prisoners of war by corpse. Freezing, hungry, depressed, exhausted, we run up the stairs into the room, where first of all we light all the lamps, which are the only source of heat, except for our bodies. We take off our outer clothing, try to scrape the sticking mud off the surface. Everything on us is drenched. Since we have no blankets to cover our bodies, wet and dirty overcoats are the only protection against further heat loss in our sleep. I ate the previously accumulated stocks of bread, fish and lard, went out into the corridor, lay down on the floor, curled up like a snail in complete exhaustion. My head was spinning with thoughts. Has the merciful God forgotten us? God is silent. The consequences of December 24 stress did not last long. Severe colds, coughs, flu, and dysentery spread like an epidemic. Until the new year of 1944, I managed to stay away from these torments. On the morning of January 1, teams of no more than 50A of the roster were gathered at the gatehouse to go to work. The most important specialists were absent from the assembly line. The assembly stood still, which meant that no parts and assemblies had arrived from the auxiliary workshops. I spent the working hours of the holiday making a spoon from a thick aluminum billet. This spoon then accompanied me all the way, returned with me to my homeland, and to this day is kept at my home. On the handle is embossed Krasnoyarsk 1.1. The weather continued to be capricious. After a brief period of frost suddenly thawed again, rain. There was ice everywhere. At night I woke up with a severe pain in my stomach. May the reader forgive me for going to recount what followed this anxiety. A stomach ache and an urgent need to go to the latrine. I have to get up, put on my pants and boots, put on my overcoat, go down the stairs from the second floor into the courtyard, where puddles of rainwater glisten on a layer of slippery ice. It's hard to stay on your feet on such a surface. But the latrine, one for the whole camp area, is located at a distance of about 100 meters from the building. Moreover, at a level 15-20 meters below. This slope must be overcome to the place of urgently needed relief. The pain is stabbing. It is infinitely difficult to keep the balance. I fall twice. The last meters I slip, sitting on the wet surface of the ice. I finally arrive. I've done what I needed to do. The pain is waning a bit. Going back, much more difficult because of the need to overcome the climb. Walked up the slope and up the stairs, undressed, lay down in my seat in the hallway, and the pain with all the phenomena returns. How many times this process was repeated during this night I do not remember. I only firmly remember the fact that during this night I did not sleep any more, and I had to lie down only for minute segments. Morning rise, call to check in and get off to work. Trying to get a release from work, without success. There is no paper that the patient must present to the duty officer. Such certificates are issued by a doctor, and there is no doctor in the morning at 6 o'clock. A prisoner without a certificate is on his feet, so he is able to work. The day passed like the night, with the only difference that the route from the workplace to the sanitary room was under the roof and without an inclined roller.